Hi, welcome to another episode of the Handful of These podcast, where we bring you practical Buddhist wisdom for a happier life. Is ignorance bliss? In the process of wanting to be a good person or being taught to be a good person, we learn how to identify right from wrong. And we are also reminded of moral conducts and standards, and thus become increasingly cautious of our own actions, sometimes fearing the consequences, or we'll feel ashamed if we were to fall short. So, wouldn't it actually be better if we remained ignorant? We'll be happier, right? This episode, we will talk about how the fear of wrongdoing and shame can actually lead us to peace. I know it sounds paradoxical, which is why we have our guest today, Sister Miyen, and also my co host to talk about this, because we know fear and shame, they are very unpleasant feelings. So, how is it possible that it can result in peace? And is it really true that these mental qualities can pave the way to enlightenment? A lot of big questions, and this episode is going to be very educational. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Hi, good to see you, Sister Miyen. I'm joined with Cheryl to chat with you today.
Thanks for inviting me, Kai Xin and Cheryl, to join you in this wonderful series of podcasts with interesting topic to share with your listeners. So I'm actually very happy and excited to have the chat with you today.
Yeah, definitely. Today's subject is quite interesting because we're going to talk about fear and shame. And there is this term in the Buddhist scripture, which is Hirī Otappa. We're going to unpack a lot of that to see where does these two words fit into our life. Because I think in a religious context, we sometimes feel like, oh, I'm not a good enough Buddhist. I did something wrong. Then there's the sense of shame and guilt. But it can get to a point where it's not so beneficial. And I personally in the past have a lot of misconceptions about it. Just for our listeners, a brief background about Sister Miyen, who's on this podcast with us today. She's a clinical psychologist, more than 27 years, helping individuals, couples, families to teach them on how to be a better person, either in a form of leadership or in a form of managing crisis as well as emotion. She also does psychotherapy. I do want to start off this episode with a first question. In our modern world, there are a lot of distractions and vices. I would say that a lot of people would agree that it's quite challenging to be a good person because sometimes people shout at you, they do certain nasty things, and the tendency is, oh, I want to fight back or I want to hurt another person. So, how do we actually not be triggered by all these temptations or these responses and end up hurting others? How does Hirī Otappa come into the picture, this sense of fear and shame?
Like you say, we are not doing justice to our topic itself, especially these two very important mental qualities in our short podcast today. So I'll try my best to unpack as much as I can. It is a difficult practice. Today I'm speaking more as a Buddhist practitioner rather than a professional psychologist. From the Buddhist perspective, I myself personally find that in our Buddhist teaching, Hiri and Otappa, these are the twin mental qualities that are present in all of us. And these mental qualities, they are associated with skillful action. At times, they are referred to as the two superheroes that protect the world or the guardians of the world. If you Google Hiri and Otappa, you will see all these words popping up. These are very important mental qualities. It actually helps us to make right choices in life. How do we act? How do we speak? How do we think? Hopefully in a helpful, healthy, and skillful way for us to uphold ourselves as a human being, especially our moral conduct. And of course, in Buddhist practice, the importance of keeping the precepts. So these two mental qualities are huge. I'm not sure whether you would like me to delve into the definition, because sometimes the definition itself can cause a lot of misunderstanding too.
I see Cheryl nodding her head. We would agree that it's good to maybe just define what exactly is Hiri and what is Otappa in short, and then we can slowly unpack and clear some of the wrong views or misconceptions.
Yes. Hiri refers to the inner conscience, refraining us from doing deeds that would jeopardize our self-respect, honor, and dignity as a human being. In a way, it's an inner ability to see unwholesomeness arising as shameful or wrong. Yeah, this is where different terminology has been used to translate the Pali term Hiri. We have moral shame as one of the main one. But I think the English translation, moral shame, is a bit tricky. I really like the ability to see unwholesomeness as shameful. Our awareness of the value of human being. Otappa, on the other hand, refer to the healthy fear of wrongdoings. I don't want to do this unwholesome action because by doing this, I'm going to bring harm to myself and others. That means the ability to actually reflect on consequences. As human beings, we do have responsibility and awareness of our action, karma, and so forth. But a lot of the English words that describe Otappa, they use the word moral dread or moral fear. I prefer to just use Hiri and Ottappa, having a clearer understanding of the actual definition. But again, it can cause a lot of misunderstanding from the English term itself.
Yeah, I think the words fear and shame are very intense words. It elicits a very negative reaction. In our day-to-day, we're trying to avoid fear and shame. I really like how you rephrase it, the ability to see unwholesomeness as shameful. It really helps us to reflect on the actions and behaviors that are actually very dirty in nature. That's why it's shameful. Rather than us having that shame that perhaps comes from wrong conditioning.
I would like to share an example to illustrate Hirī Otappa. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned that it's something that we innately have, Hiri, a sense of shame or conscience. We know what exactly is wrong or right. So there was one day, my mom, when she was fetching my niece from preschool, she's around 4 years old. She's a little bit out of character, very unusually quiet. And then my mom kind of noticed that something is amiss. And then she found out that my niece has taken from their preschool a Lego. And then she put it in her arms. She kind of know that she's not supposed to do it, but she also doesn't want to tell. So there's a little bit of like, okay, what if I get found out, you know? Like, will my mom scold her? Will her mother scold her? And what's the consequences? Which kind of led her to also be not so vocal about what is wrong. She probably have taken it by accident and then only found out about it afterwards. So I thought that's particularly interesting because at such a young age, she already know that taking things that is not hers, it's not so right. So would that be an example of
In a way, I think your niece has gone into another experience. The Pali word that I can recall is Kukkucca. It is actually the guilt and remorse happening. I think this is, again, very, very natural. A lot of us have this frequent misunderstanding. We get a Hirī Otappa quite mixed up with Kukkucca, remorse. So actually, Kukkucca is the feeling that arises after the bad action has been committed. So your niece have taken the Lego. It's actually committed already. That's why it is already Kukkucca. Whereas Hirī and Ottappa is actually the conflict in our mind and the feeling that arises before the bad action happened. So they are actually protective factor. Hopefully they are here to protect our mind from moral defilement or immoral action. Thank you for bringing this example up. That's why a lot of times the classes on Hirī Otappa, we have to discuss about Kukkucca because it comes together in that sense.
It's kind of like the cartoon, you know, they have the angel and devil on top of our head. So
yes.
It is before to prevent us from even taking the Lego. But then after you have already committed, then that's where the remorse comes in.
And the guilt comes in.
That's interesting. Could you give us some examples of real life situation of Hirī and Ottappa?
Okay, actually, all of us, in a way, innately have Hirī Otappa in us. But it is still important for us to develop or practice it. For this, I actually want to bring us back to a very important reference from Ashin Buddhaghosa, 5th century Indian Theravada Buddhist commentator, translator, and philosopher. So Ashin Buddhaghosa has actually highlighted 8 factors that can help us to facilitate or cultivate Hirī and Ottappa. Hopefully we have these 8 factors to guide us further. First, remember, we are a person of good birth. Birth is rare in our Buddhist practice. So remember that it is not worthy of a person with good birth to do unwholesome action. Remember our rare birth as a human being. Number 2, this unwholesome action are not worthy of a matured person like me. Hopefully, our maturity from our practice will also prompt us to recall that. Third, these unwholesome actions are just unacceptable. I am a strong and courageous person. I have been practicing all our Buddhist practices. Therefore, I should not do this. Fourth, these unwholesome actions are usually committed by those who are unwise. Hopefully, I have wisdom from all my Buddhist practices to guide me. Fifth, I am a Buddhist practitioner. So I would reflect on our Buddhist doctrine, which always teach us on wholesomeness. Reflect on the dignity of the Buddha, our teacher, who has given us the Buddha Dharma as the path, especially our Noble Eightfold Path. So let me keep to this. My Buddhist practice is my inheritance in this present life. So I would like to honor this for myself and also for the other people in my life, because if I do something unwholesome, I'm going to hurt them. So he described these 8 beautiful factors that can help us to practice Hiri, if we can remember. Just go back to the basics, 4 Noble Truths, Noble Eightfold Path. You'll be guided in what Ashin has actually mentioned. He says there's another 4 factors. Clear understanding of the consequences will totally stop us from committing unwholesomeness. He says this: we will be afraid of doing something that we're going to regret later. If we know this unwholesomeness is going to be criticized, that we're going to be punished in the present life or the future life. Very related to our core Buddhist practice. I always love contemplating and reminding myself of maintaining Hirī and Ottappa in myself. That's how we can practice to cultivate Hirī and Ottappa. I know it's a long explanation, but we will share with our listener all the important links.
It's good that you actually brought up the context of the different line of thoughts, because then these are signposts on the kind of narrative that goes in our head. Then we'll recognize, oh, this is actually trying to guard my morality so that I would have no regret in the future. In fact, I would share another anecdotal experience to kind of make this a little bit more relatable. I would say, especially the Dhamma practice, because we have the 5 precepts. So no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, and no intoxicant, right? The precept itself has always been at the back of my head and has actually allowed me to avoid troubles or dangers, particularly when it comes to lying. This one is quite difficult, I would say, because white life is also involved, and sometimes you not saying anything, hiding the truth, if you're strict about it, it's also considered lying, right? So that was actually a very interesting instance at work. I was in a moral dilemma. Our team has actually accidentally circulated a confidential piece of information from client A to client B. And this was by accident. So the moment when we found out, it was a moral dilemma, because if we don't tell, then the client won't know that we have made this mistake. But if we do tell, our client might feel that, hey, why don't we kind of guard their confidential information safely? There might be trust that is lost. But then there's also the other side, which is, what if we don't tell? And eventually our client were to find out. And we knew that we should have told. So there was kind of like a little bit of ding dong, and then I kind of couldn't sleep as well. In the end, we made the difficult decision, which is to own up to our mistake, because it is our responsibility. And I think the whole concern is about, okay, will we destroy the trust? But the very fact that we're hiding the truth, there's no transparency, there's no trust, right? So we have to bear our consequences. Our client actually appreciated it. What we thought would be quite a big hoo-ha didn't unfold in the manner that we expect. We expect our clients to actually scold us. So what happened was, our client was very thankful and say, okay, it was by mistake. Can you let us know who are the relevant parties? And also let me check with my team, who is part of legals and comms, to see what can be done. And then for us, of course, our offer is, okay, whatever corrective actions you want us to take, we will go ahead and take it. But it was such a big load off all of our chairs, because the very fact that we are not hiding anything, to me, it's about keeping the precept of honesty as well as being truthful. Also, from a leadership standpoint, it does set some form of tone, right? Like, how do
Yes.
you own up to your mistake and say that it's okay, we make mistake, be responsible for our actions? There's so much more respect from there rather than doing it otherwise.
Wow. I'm so proud, of what has transpired between you, your team, and the other team. And this is the amazing part, because we human beings actually have conscience. We have the ability to recognize mistake, and we know that if we do not resolve it, it's going to be sticky. And it's very interesting that we can't go against natural emotions. In the psychology of emotions in Buddhism, there are 4 sets of basic challenging emotion that none of us can escape. The example that you gave is guilt and the shame. The 4 challenging emotions are anger and hatred, fear and anxiety, grief or sorrow, guilt or shame. It will arise. We cannot run away from it. And of course, the more we are able to reflect and practice Hirī Otappa, hopefully it will prevent occurrence of the 4 sets of challenging emotion. And your example is right on the dot on that. Instead of anger or hatred from your client, they actually have positive emotion. They were appreciative of your honesty. So you see, we are always very stuck on the negativity, but we forgot that there's always the other positive part of emotions and actions, of course. I'm so happy to hear that situation actually resolves. I cannot imagine that stress that you guys were having due to that.
I was quite stressful. Like, will we lose a client because of that? Our reputation will be tarnished. And everything turned out to be all right. And I think it was for the better. I thought whatever you mentioned was so true. Fear and shame, connotation is usually very negative, very intense. Ajahn Jarasaro clarified to say it's actually wise shame and wise fear. When you use it skillfully, it actually helps you to reduce the emotions that you talk about, anxiety, restlessness, and helps us be more peaceful.
Definitely. That's why Hirī and Ottappa are called the 2 superheroes or the protectors of the world. We need this as a human being. In our world, it's so scary. There are a lot of bad deeds, evilness because of the lack of Hirī and Ottappa. If we didn't have Hirī and Ottappa to protect us, we have to then deal with Kukkucca. It's when the bad action has been committed, but we need to deal with the guilt, the remorse, the shame.
I got a question that could be quite obvious. So what would be considered a good deed or a bad deed? So for example, in Kai Xin's case, it's obvious following the 5 precepts. That's examples of maintaining morality, maintaining goodness. But a lot of times, what we think is bad is not really bad. For example, pre-marital sex. Some people would think it's very bad. But if you dive a little bit deeper, it's because society said so or your parents say so. So it's very subjective to a certain extent. How do we know what is truly considered a good deed?
That's very tricky. To me, not good deeds, that any deeds that does not fall under our practice of 5 precepts. It's actually very deep itself. So that will definitely always guide us to perform good deeds and to abstain from bad deeds. Another Buddhist practice will be the Noble Eightfold Path. To practice the Noble Eightfold Path itself is not easy. Having the right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. That itself will take us many lives to practice this. Based on what you have actually mentioned, that example is very frequently asked by people. So is premarital sex a sexual misconduct, breaking the 3rd precept? So I would say that it all depends on that 2 person involved in that act. The element that you touch on, the cultural aspect or the religious aspect, is tricky. Some religious rules is no premarital sex. So then they will view that as very negative. But I think our 3rd precept, to abstain from sexual misconduct, it has to do with these 2 individuals. Are they truly clear and respectful of each other when they are in that sexual relationship? Are they both willing? It's very tricky on the frame of mind of that 2 person. If there is clarity on both sides, then it's a mutual relationship. If one person is hesitant or not comfortable and so forth, then of course that act itself is a misconduct. Right or wrong, the mind always want to judge. It's so tricky. If we want to go deeper into the perception that arises in us in making that judgment itself, what are many more layers behind it, that make us arrive at the right or the wrong? It's much more worthwhile to go back to actually investigate the processes rather looking at what is right or what is wrong. It's so subjective. But of course, living in a society, there are rules set by the country, the government. Of course, those it's hard to challenge. But in terms of moral or social rules, that become very tricky. My suggestion is, if we are practicing Buddhist, always have that mindfulness to bring us back to investigate the processes that's happening internally. Learn from that processes itself. So I'm not sure whether I answer you, Cheryl.
You have to remind us that it's important to understand what's really going on internally, because you cannot lie to yourself to a certain extent.
And I think it's also important to understand the purpose behind even keeping the precepts or discerning what's right and wrong. What I find beautiful about the Buddhist teaching is everything should lead us to peace. So if we have this mental restlessness and agitation by saying, oh, but it's a gray area, is it right, is it wrong, and caught up with this endless debate, then it doesn't actually help us free ourselves from suffering. There's this term called sila bata paramasa, clinging to rules and rituals, or even clinging on to our views. And it's a very subtle part of practice, because sometimes we like to follow rules, especially a very Asian context, right? Like, oh, this means this, B means B, C means C. But the world isn't so black and white. And I think precepts is meant for us to find that peace and also live harmoniously with the society around us, which is why in the discourses, a lot of times actually the Buddha did mention to abide by the law of the nation, to not cause a disruption. As practitioners, our own responsibility to also say, okay, if I were to do this, yes, it's a little bit gray. Once I do this deed, will I then have regret? Me, I found that to be very helpful. If it doesn't bring peace, then perhaps I won't venture into that path.
Somehow there is this extreme category where some people have that deep ignorance about the world, about being human. They will not be able to even have the realization, the reflection, or the awareness of wholesomeness, unwholesomeness in the first place. That will be the very hard evil, really hardcore bad deeds and so forth. But to me, that's very small percentage. But the bottom line is the higher percentage of all of us have this basic ability to know what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. A lot of times, because we are challenged by our greed, we want, never mind lah. So I think it's a lot more on that. In our Buddhist practice, we really understand our greed, hatred, and delusion is always with us. How do we deal with that? For me, the Noble Eightfold Path has really unfolded for us to answer the cultivation of the mind, the mental development, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the hardest part for a lot of Buddhists, the meditative practice and effort. It's only with that do we actually train our mind every moment, so that hopefully we do have this calmness, clarity in us that we can carry to face the world with a lot of vices and evilness and so forth. We can't avoid that. But hopefully with this cultivation, no matter how ugly it is out there, hopefully we can maintain that inner freedom and peace, which to me is the main Buddhist teaching or Buddhist practice. If you don't practice right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness, you're not able to cultivate Hirī and Ottappa. No way.
I think Hirī and Ottappa also helps to protect our long-term happiness. For example, the fifth precept, to not intoxicate. But sometimes life is very hard. You just want to numb yourself by intoxicating.
the temptation, fighting greed is very challenging, right, for all of us in this materialistic world, right?
Yeah, I do see how mindfulness and concentration, especially, can help us to have that clarity of mind to even tap into our own inner wisdom. Because with many things happening around us, it's very easy to be swayed. Like if we hang out with the wrong company, then we would think that it's okay to indulge, but it doesn't necessarily lead to our long term welfare. Yeah, so also very important to hang out with wise friends in order to kind of help us stay on the path to recalibrate. And most importantly, we have to be truthful to ourselves.
Since today we're talking about Hirī and Ottappa, I would like to highlight that a lot of our Buddhist core teachings are all interconnected. But Hirī and Ottappa, it is placed under the treasure Dhana Sutta, is 2 out of the 7 noble treasure. So maybe let me just share with the listener, what are the 7 noble treasure? We will give the link to the audience. So the first category is actually moral training. Under the moral training, there are 4 treasure, 4 practices. The treasure of faith, Saddha. Start with Saddha, our faith towards Dharma. Second one is the treasure of moral virtue, followed by the treasure of Hiri, moral shame, and the treasure of Otappa, moral fear. So this 4 is grouped under moral training. And with this comes in the next category, the meditation training. Here they have 2 treasures for us to practice. The treasure of learning. And I think it's very deep. The next one is the treasure of charity or generosity. It's very interesting that this sutta, they place it under meditation training. The last one, the number 7, is actually the wisdom training. And this is the treasure of wisdom, Panya. See how important is that Hirī and Ottappa is within this 7 that Buddha has actually taught all of us. Hold this as treasures in your life as human being. It's very, very near, interconnected back to our Noble Eightfold Path. So it's all interconnected. The moral training is going to be connected to our wisdom training, and it's going to be connected to our samadhi training, the mental cultivation training. Noble Eightfold Path is also 3 categories, right? It's similar with the 7 treasure. But the one I really like is the first treasure, Saddha, faith. We should ask ourselves, how deep is our faith towards the Buddha Dhamma? So how deeply or strongly we understand the 4 noble truths, the 3 defilements, Noble Eightfold Path, and of course the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the mental cultivation, the meditative practice. All this core itself takes many lives to practice, but go back to that again and again. Yeah, and I think this is so complementary to how they position the Hirī and Ottappa. Very systematic. Our Buddhist suttas are very systematic. It's very interesting how they categorize it. But if you actually are able to look at the matching of the categories, then you find that the practice are actually very flowing. Like these 7 treasures, to me, it's so flowing with the Noble Eightfold Path.
Thank you for sharing. I have a curious question. You mentioned learning and charity is under the meditation training. Can you elaborate more on that?
Okay. Disclaimer, I may not understand the Treasure Dhana Sutta well, so please, listeners, forgive me if I'm not clear or misquoting, but based on my reading and my understanding, why the treasure of learning and the treasure of charity is under meditation training. I think learning is very clear, because in meditation training, the learning of the mind system especially, if you do not have this ability, passion, to actually want to learn, then meditation training will become very difficult. So the attitude in learning is very important for meditation training. Charity is very interesting. If we actually hold this treasure of charity in our life, which means that we are a generous person, a giving person, and also know how to receive at the same time, we are a very balanced person. This balance is also very important in our meditation practice. If we always have that greed, that stinginess and that holding back, which is direct opposite of the treasure of charity, you can imagine the state of your mind. Very constricted, right? Versus generosity, that openness in your practice, which is definitely very important for the meditation training, the quality of the mind. So the practice of generosity itself, it's just not like, donate. It's a very meaningful and detailed process of what's going through your mind, right? That readiness, that openness, that happiness in giving. Sometimes we give, but it comes with, I shouldn't have given so much. When you go into the processes, corrupted already, right?
Haven't really let go
and
renounced. Actually, speaking of meditation, just want to circle back and tie it to Hirī Otappa. I do know some people might say, hey, I don't want to get too deep into this Dhamma practice because then it kind of makes me feel very uptight. Like in the past, ignorance is bliss, right? I don't know all these 5 precepts. I don't meditate. I can still enjoy life in a different way, and fleeting happiness, that's just part of life. So they kind of restrict themselves from entering the Dhamma practice in a too deep manner. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like there's a need to recalibrate the view in order to serve them while they're still practicing without, compromising their happiness?
That's a very tough question, Kai Xin. I think I'm going to approach it this way. If that individual truly is happy, peaceful, blissful with whatever they are practicing or living with, it is fine. But if it's ignorant bliss or more of a denial kind of situation, no lah, I don't want to practice 5 precepts, it's very restricting and things like that. If it's more towards that, they will have to deal with a lot of those challenging emotions that is going to arise. A lot of times people have to discover the hard way after they encounter the difficulties. Then only they will actually appreciate, what Buddha has taught us. If, as we are sharing or talking, some people say, all this is not going to be helpful for me. My approach is always, it's okay. As long as you are actually doing fine, you're okay. But then when they encounter challenges, if they come to us, that's where, hopefully we have the skillfulness to impart our Buddhist practices of teaching to them subtly. That's where we are not going to talk about Hirī and Ottappa, because I think it's already Kukkucca a lot of times, but we're going to help them to look at that emotion of guilt, remorse, shame. What are you going to do with it? What can you do with it? And whether our Buddhist practices then can help them to deal with it. So that's an easy way to convince them to practice. Nobody's going to go for meditation retreat if they are doing fine, I tell you. But really, people who really encounter problems and then they meet people that can share with them the Dhamma in the right condition, right timing, then they would hopefully attempt and appreciate it. And there are also people who goes into all our Buddhist practices, but they will still have a lot of hindrances. In meditation practice, the 5 hindrances itself is great. You can imagine it is a lifelong learning to even face all these hindrances. So I would say that if people are in denial, we continue to be a good person, a good friend, or a good colleague, to be there to support them when they need that. That's where our generosity in helping will be helpful at that point.
Thanks for that. I think that's very wise, and it also allows people to navigate based on their own capacity, and we don't become like a precept or Dhamma police, because it can then be another situation where we feel that we are more superior and people are more inferior and they should do things a certain way, which is not helpful for our practice as well. So there's a lot of inner search and inner calibration that we have to do. This very nicely wraps up our session in a nice tone. So today we have talked about quite a lot of things, starting with what exactly is Hirī Otappa and how it's commonly misunderstood as Kukkucca. So the first one is having wise fear and shame before we commit a wrong deed. So that's going to protect us from even going down the wrong path, or a path that we might end up feeling guilt and feeling remorseful, which is Kukkucca. And then you also shared about the importance of keeping precept, and really there's no real right and wrong. We have to understand our thought processes. It's really about the interaction between people, right? When we have the precept, whether it's between you and your partner or you and society,
you and yourself.
Yes, definitely. So it's all intertwined, and we ultimately have to see how peaceful we are when we are embodying all these qualities or trying to be an upright person. Also, you talked about the noble treasures, moral training, meditation training, as well as wisdom training. We're going to put resources in the show notes for our listeners who want to find out more about each of these treasures. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about being truthful and honest. Innately, we already know what is beneficial. We just need that mental clarity and stillness to tap into our inner wisdom. Sometimes be the support to our friends around us without forcing, and sometimes also lean on others to guide us on the right path. So, thank you very much, Sister Miyen. Any last advice for our listeners before we say goodbye?
I would say maybe start with the treasure of faith and really maintain the treasure of learning. If I would pick 2 out of the 7, I'd like to thank Kai Xin and Cheryl for inviting me to share this difficult topic. I hope we are able to shed some light through all our definition and dialogue and so forth. Nevertheless, I wish everyone a fruitful path in our cultivation. I definitely place mental cultivation, meditation as the path that hopefully all of us will continue to stay on. So naturally, thank you to both of you for having this session with me. And we'd like to thank all the listeners, especially when they click on our podcast and listen to us. We thank them for spending time with us.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Sister
Sister
Miyen, for
Miyen.
that. Thanks for tuning in till the end. That's a very insightful sharing. And if you'd like to look at some more resources about the topic, you can go to our transcript or show notes. We have placed some links there. And also, if you've benefited from this podcast, it would really help us if you can give us a 5-star review and share it with a friend. Until the next episode, may you stay happy and wise.